I believe that Raid Raptor will take 1 or 2 top cut spots in the next YCS. With the arrival of Phantom Nightmare and Maze of Memories, we are now entering a brand new format of Fire, or maybe even longer if Konami doesn't do anything about these cards. With the new format, I think it is about time to give you guys another tier list. So I'm going to show you guys all the different decks that are available and where I think they perform at a YCS. Will I think they can dominate the YCS? Will there be a few in top cut, 1 or 2 make it in, or can they maybe snag a spot? Are they unlikely to make top cut, or will they not make top cut at all? That's how I'm going to rank things. I'm going to show you how I feel about each of the decks on screen and explain why. See how things have changed with the new releases, with the new ban list changes, and how they interact with each other to make a new metagame. And as you guys can see, I think Raid Raptor is, out of nowhere, a playable deck that may get a couple spots of top cut. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, Raid Raptor's got a few new cards from Phantom Nightmare. They got brand new Exceed monsters, new rank up spell, as well as new effect monsters. And what these accomplish is to give a new boss monster, the Raid Raptor Rising Rebellion. That one lets them nuke the opponent's field when it's summoned, and the new rank up spell is a quick play spell to summon on the opponent's turn. On top of that, the Exceed monster also copies the effect of Raid Raptors in the grave, and it also is unaffected by card effects, while having a giant stat line, so it's very good. There also is a new Exceed monster to summon with Raider's Knight that searches your spells or your monsters, which is very good, and then your level 4 new extenders, which make the deck more consistent and more powerful as far as 1-card combos goes. All that being together, it reminds me of Unchained. Its weakness to Maxi may be a big reason why we don't see it being played in the OCG. It has a lot of solid 1-card combos and strong 2-card combos that are pretty good against hand traps, make really strong fields, have good resiliency to board breakers, and also give you great follow-up. So if you want to see content on Raid Raptors, please let me know, but I think this deck is actually rather solid. And while it may not be the best deck in the room, there's the Fire decks will almost certainly take that spot. It has a lot of potential. And you see here, there's only a few decks actually rate above it. If I want you to play something that's cheap and something that's still strong and something that's different than a YCS, Raid Raptor is a deck I would strongly consider. But other than Raid Raptor, okay, let's see how else we would rank everything else in this chart. Next up here, we got Brand of the Despia. So Brand of the Despia has seen some play in the OCG. Their ban list, of course, is different, but part of the reason it's seeing some play is because a lot of the interactions the Fire deck presents are destruction based, and notoriously those are not that effective against the branded combo decks. The main way to beat the branded decks is with negation. They aren't the best at trading into those, but when removal is what you're seeing, then it thrives. That's not to say the Fire King deck has no negations. That's why I think the Brand of Despia deck is still not top tier, but it does have some favorable interactions into the Fire King deck that ultimately makes it not bad. It also can utilize Shaddoll Fusion, as well as just other extra deck tools to send Nail Shaddoll Ariel to the grave. Ariel being able to banish up to 3 cards in either player's grave. You can banish opponent's Garunix, their Promethean Princess, their Ponix, their Dibelstar. I guess those don't matter as much, but there are plenty of good resources in the grave to banish. The same reason we see Soul Release being considered as a side deck option for the first time in probably a decade as Ariel. And while that Shaddoll package can fit pretty comfortably into multitude of decks, the branded deck probably utilizes it the best, already playing with those fusion cards and being able to do it with other manners as well. For example, you can use Cartesia plus a Light of Dark to make Grand Guignol. Grand Guignol can then send Shaddoll Apcalone from extra deck to the grave. Apcalone can then add Ariel, discard it, and we can resolve it via that method. Same thing with the Dear Servant, you get it through that way as well. There are plenty of ways to get to it, so you have that extra graveyard disruption that's pretty good. And then as far as the end field for Despia, it's always been really strong, at least it has been for a while since the new support cards came out. So yeah, it's very good. However, the issue is still consistency. Sometimes it gets choked really early on by a single Ash Blossom. And also, we're going to see a huge increase of Anti-Spell Fragrance, which is one of the absolute bane of existence for branded players. As someone who played the deck about 2 years ago at the WCQ, that card ruined so many of my duels. I think this is pretty much on par with Raid Raptors, but they have some cool things going for them, and they are pretty strong, and they'll get a couple spots in Top Cut, 1 or 2 maybe, but they will definitely not be the star of the show. As for star of the show, next was Fire King. I need to establish this real quick. I think this will dominate. This and a couple of the Fire decks, but it is for sure the year of Fire. With Promethean Princess and Poplar and Bonfire, this is the deck to beat. It can play through hand traps pretty well. It can play with a couple cards while playing a lot of non-engine very well. Its end field is very diverse. It doesn't lose to board breakers really without pairing multiple together. It has interrupts from the field, from the hand, or from the grave. It has disruption in the form of destruction, And they can also use negation with Arvatsa, and depending on how you build the board, you can also use Appaloosa there as well to get more in. You can get the pops with Princess, the pop with Kieran. You can use SP to banish via IP, or you can just use its second effect, banish again. It's a very good deck, and I'm not going to explain it too much because surely you've all seen the hype by now. The deck's hype is warranted. It's very good, and I'm expecting to see this deck and maybe some other decks that are very similar to it definitely be the top contenders and be winning most of the events, while also taking up the largest portions of Top Cut. Next up is Centurion. So Centurion saw a bit of Top Cut representation at the last YCS in Bologna, and I did not think it was very good then. I am still a believer of that. I think it is just a weak deck in terms of it plays like one card, but is often weak to disruption, and then the boards it puts up, if you're not resolving Calamity, are not good. On the bright side, you get to use a lot of hand traps or a lot of non-engine cards that can help you in a format where you do want a lot of that, which I do think we're in. I just think if you want to do that, there are so many better routes to do that, and it's not like the deck's a budget deck anyways, so I would probably avoid Centurion. Now, it did get support in the form of Bonfire, giving you more consistency. Obviously, there's other Pyro monsters than just Snake Eye Ash. So Centurion, I still think is not good enough, and for me, it's a deck I think is unlikely to make Top Cut. I may be aggressively negative towards this deck in terms of my lack of faith in it, but it really just doesn't sit well with me in terms of how good the deck is. Next up is Chimera. Chimera was a deck we saw a couple months ago, and it seemed like a pretty good option. They got more support in Age of Overlord, and we're seeing it's going to get more support in Phantom Nightmare as well. However, it's recently fallen off a bit, and you look at the last few YCSs, this card really wasn't that well represented. And will that change with a new set? I'm going to say no. While this deck doesn't lose to removal that much, so it's not that weak into stuff like Fire King, I think its overall output in terms of power just can't keep up with these new Fire decks. It's got no new support, and it was already falling off before. We're going to continue to see it fall off, and I think that really holds it back. Now, with more support, maybe it'll rise back above with a new illusion card next set that lets you search any other illusion. But right now, the deck has a lot of really strong cards to search other illusion cards or cards in the archetype, but they're missing an actual powerhouse to make use of all their searchability. So for now, I think this deck will not Top Cut. I think it has fallen to a pretty low tier. You still have a couple gimmicks with the new Baphomet card from Age of Overlord. I guess it's not new anymore, where you can send a Beast Warrior Fiend, or sorry, not Beast Warrior, a Beast, a Fiend, or an Illusion back to grave, and then revive it and do some combos that way. End of Anubis, which is still fine versus Fire Kings, but that's not enough to make it stand on its own. Next up is Labyrinth. So I actually don't think this deck is that good. But it did get new support, right? It got Transaction Rollback, which was a huge card for it in Maze of Millennia, and it also got the support from Blackout Laughs in Phantom Nightmare. And the more important one is for sure Transaction Rollback, letting you dodge Ashen Bell or your Welcome Traps more often, giving you more output potential, and accelerating your deck a lot. The Blackout Laughs is still good because you can discard it off a furniture card and then banish it to cause something like Rescue Ace Turbulence and stop your opponent from making these grand plays. With all that in mind, then it was decent before and should be even better now. I think the biggest problem here is it actually has a really bad matchup into the Fire decks, specifically Fire King. I think Snake Eye is not great either. Rescue Ace it's fine, but not fantastic. And if we're seeing those decks rise to the top, you don't enter a tournament with your worst matchup being the most popular deck. And why is that? For one, I think that Labyrinth takes advantage a lot of the time of it not being the most powerful engine, but it being able to go on for a long time. Its resource game is very strong, and it still has some decent level of disruption behind it. Lovely is a very powerful card. But Fire King just grinds almost better than it. Promethean Princess and Garunix coming back every turn is nasty, and one of the biggest things here is Princess. And if you're expecting to go a long game and you're summoning on both players' turns, which Labyrinth does, you're going to have a Princess being used against you every single turn. That card doesn't get banished after it uses its effect and comes back, so when it's going to keep recycling, going to keep coming back, it's going to keep being a problem. You're pretty much playing a body down every single turn, and it's a big body. It's a 2700 attack body that also revives your card. That on top of if Garunix comes back, and if everything else is triggering as well, it's just too much for, I think, Labyrinth to deal with. As well as its disruption just not being that well positioned, right? Popping a card with Lovely is not that meaningful versus a deck that triggers off pop effects like Fire King. Also, a deck that goes super wide, like Snake Eye, summoning a bunch of bodies, popping one card doesn't do that much. Now, this deck can fit in a decent number of non-engines, so sometimes you can try pair a couple non-engine together and then go furniture effects, and that'll get the job done, and you can win that way. However, I really don't think it's that brilliant, and I actually think, at first, I was unsure of why OCG did not play this deck that much. I would have expected to be more represented. I just think it matches up so poorly into the top decks that it's actually just low tier. As we see those decks start to fall off in future months as hits happen on the ban list, I think Labyrinth is going to be a super strong position because it's as good as it was before, plus more. It just has bad matchups right now. And it's an important part of understanding a format. If the dominant deck is different, then you have to think about all those matchups change now and how it shifts the entire ecosystem of the meta around it. And we'll see that here with Lab, where even though it got support, it's just not going to hold up. Next up is Mannadium. Alright, so this is a deck that I've also underestimated in the past. Will I do that again? I'm going to say yes, I will underestimate it again. I've never really been a fan of this deck. I think Droll will see a lot of play in this format. Droll is not the most brilliant hand trap, but it's fine. And when you want a lot of non-engine, it's a card you'll include after the best few hand traps. And when it's in the meta, Mannadium, it almost feels like it has a 30% automatic loss factor, which sucks. I also don't think it plays great into destruction type removal effects. So when you're going second versus Fire King, I think it's going to struggle like bad. Anything with Princess, which should be a lot of decks. So I think for that point, it's just not that good. And you can't fit a lot of non-engine in there. So if you can stop your opponent and then combo off, maybe that's great. And if you go first, obviously the deck is really strong. Outside of Droll, there's not really a good way to stop it when they go first. And that is a huge boost to the deck. So I do think it's probably on par with Lab, where you can snag a top cut maybe, but I would not expect them in every single YCS top cut. And they're really not that good. Next up is Ashen. So I know a lot of people were excited about this deck. They saw the art and they were thrilled. And they say it looks like it's some Dark Souls. I've never played the game, so I don't know. But for me, it reminds me of Pompeii-esque style lore, and that's super cool. And the art is pretty good. Is it good though? It shouldn't be a surprise, but no, this deck will not make top cut. This is just not it. It has a lot of the makings for a good deck, where it has search cards, it has lethal setups, it can have disruption, but it doesn't have enough search cards consistency yet. It doesn't have enough power interruption yet. It doesn't have enough ability to play through fields yet. It just doesn't have enough cards yet. And that should be pretty obvious, right? You gotta wave one of 6 or 7 cards. And now sometimes that can be enough, like we saw with Burning Abyss 8 or so years ago, but in this case, it's not. It needs a little more to come together as a cohesive deck. And right now, its restrictions are too overbearing for it to be splashed as another engine. Vados as a hand trap, who knows if that'll see play. I can talk about that in the next tier list video. But for now, Ashen is just nowhere near the radar. Hopefully with the next set, we get some new Ashen cards, and we can have a spicy meta shakeup that's different from the OCG. But that's something we'll find out in due time. Next up is Kashtira. So I actually think this deck is a lot better than people realize. I guess people are catching on now. And I'm using a Rizar here, which is banned, but this deck is really strong when it goes first. Yes, you don't have a Rizard for the auto win, but it plays really well with one card. If you get hand trapped on your Fenrir Unicorn, it's not that bad. And if it's not Imperm, they also pay a steep price as well. If your opponent's not playing multiple princesses, Unicorn can be devastating. But there's other great cards ahead as well, like SP. SP makes it so much harder to clear the Kashtira field. The deck can get follow-up very well. And you can also expand upon combos, like we've been seeing with Luke Tyler. He's been playing a Dracosack version that summons 2 tokens. Those 2 tokens become Link Spider, which then become a Heart Golem, the link to, what is it, link to, those two tokens become Link Spiders. Those Link Spiders become the Crystal Heart Golem, the Link 2 that revives the Link Spider, and that can become something else. You can make Heat Soul, draw a card, and then make something like Appaloosa. Or if you have Birth, you can then revive something back and make an IP, and then like IP plus Heat Soul. You can maybe fit in a Promethean Princess there, because you do have fires in Kashtira, and Heat Soul's a fire as well. We can keep seeing that being explored. And as well, this deck can just fit in an enormous amount of non-engine cards, right? So you can play a lot of hand traps to go with your Kashtira cards. And the nice thing is, if it's not the main focus, if everyone's playing cards with the Fire King deck, the Kashtira deck loses to not the same cards. So if your opponent's non-engine is just way less effective against you, it's decently positioned. I do think this is a meta choice, a meta call choice. I think if people prepare more for Kashtira, this deck will not do well. It is still fragile. And it does have glaring weaknesses. Going second, if your opponent puts a princess in the grave, it is really good versus Kashtira, like really good. So you have to stop them from getting to that point. And yes, you have hand traps, but it's still easier said than done. And if your opponent has enough extenders, Fire King can just push through that, you know, sometimes super easily. So it's not like Kashtira is this insane deck, but I think its ability to play Shifter, its strength going first, its ability to play so much non-engine, and the fact that all the non-engine cards that are being played aren't that good against it makes it a relatively strong pick for the next YCS if you don't want to go with a fire deck. Curious to see if this one holds up. This is one of the other bolder predictions that I have, but I rate Cashier pretty highly. Next up is Math Mech. If you guys haven't heard, Circular is banned. This card's not top. Good riddance. Well, I had to include that. No one likes Math Mech. Next up, we got Fluanderies. So this one's an interesting one for me. I'm not sure where I'd rank this, and I haven't had the time to test it in the current metagame. And now, you may be curious, why do I feel like I need to test this deck? That's because Fluanderies notoriously is pretty good into decks that are just destruction-based. Destroying the little birds doesn't matter too much. While it can matter to some degree, it's not a huge thing, especially if the disruption only hits monsters. If you can get your unexplored winds and your magnificent map to resolve, that's where the bulk of your power comes from. As well as the trap combo with Dreaming Town, summoning Empan, Ryza, or Avions being incredibly strong as disruption goes, and being able to play Shifter, they got new support in the card Swallow's Cowrie. Swallow's Cowrie lets them now get more access to their cards, more consistency, which is something he struggled with a bit, but also it means playing through Valor and Imperm. Now the problem I have with this is Valor, Imperm, Droll, Ash are all going to be very prevalent in the meta, and they are very good against Fluanderies. And I don't know if Swallow's Cowrie offsets the ability to play through Imperm and Valor enough, because it still does take a monster off field, which now, if they do have Disruption, is a little bit more iffy. Now, that is also not to say that these fire decks have no monster interruption. They do have stuff like Arvada, Appaloosa, and if they know you're playing Fluanderies, expect both those on the field, so you have to deal with those with non-engine cards typically, because your engine, while maybe you can play through them a little bit, it's not great. But I think this deck might be okay. I'm honestly not sure where it goes, and I'm going to be a bit more conservative right now and put it alongside Labyrinth and Vanadium, but it could be, I'm really not sure with Flu how good it'll be. It could be a complete flop, or it could actually be playable. Swallow's Cowrie isn't like the biggest thing in the world for it. That's not the main reason why it's good. It's just the meta lineup and how it pairs into the fire decks I'm specifically looking at, and how it's not awful either. But time will tell. While the fire decks can't remove backer the easiest, SP with IP still exists, and so does Kieran Pop. It's not like it's impossible. Maybe when I have some time, I'll practice against Flu or practice with Flu, and I'll get a better idea. But for now, I think it's there. Next up is Pearly. No, it did have some hits in the balance, but has seen some play after the fact at some regional levels. Will it keep up now? Probably not. I think this deck just really isn't that good. Going first, you can make a Noir sometimes, but it's not that easy through hand traps. And even if you get a Noir, they could play Kurikara, which is somewhat popular right now as a search target off Snake Eye Ash, or off Aware of Thou, depending on the deck. If not on the main, then likely on the side. And Goblin Bikers aren't popular, but if someone ever wanted to play against Pearly and have that side deck option, you know, that kind of ruins them. The fact that Goblin Bikers can detach from the Pearly Exceed, detach the White Cat, then turning off the effect is just insane. Like, why does it have that effect? And if Pearly ever does become a somewhat relevant threat in the meta, that's just even more silver bullets that I can't deal with. And I just wouldn't play Pearly for that reason. Now, there is an advantage to playing Purely where you can activate Street going second, and that helps for stuff like Princess, but there's still SP, there's still Kieran, and the Whale also has non-targeting destruction. There are ways to play around that to some degree. It doesn't seem terrible in that regard going second, because you have the Street and you have you have Happy Memory to help protect. I just don't think it's enough though, and I think this deck is just unlikely to top. I wouldn't be certain on that. I wouldn't bet heavily that it won't top, but I really wouldn't expect much representation in Top Cut, and it's possible, just not likely. Following that is Rika, the European specialty. I guess we got to make two tier lists, one for Europe, one for North America, because Rika probably isn't doing anything in America. But I really don't think this deck is that good still. Playing into fields, I don't think it's brilliant. Before, you'd use this deck in its non-engine spaces at board breakers, and if those aren't functioning very well right now, then I feel like this deck... I've never seen this deck succeed while playing hand traps, and truthfully, I can't tell you too much why. My Rika knowledge is still not incredible. It's definitely more than zero, but I would never call myself an expert of this deck, at least not yet. The end field is still decently strong. Rika Princess is great, Khan's great, Sheets solid, and Hyperiton's fine, Ben Glancer's fine. This end field's good. Like, I lost to it at the last regional. The power is still there when he goes first and is uninterrupted. There's a lot of hand traps right now, and the deck doesn't get to full combo, and it can't go second that well. I think it probably won't top cut. Maybe I'm being, again, overly dismissive of the deck, and maybe it's a bit higher, but I definitely don't. It may be here, but I don't have little faith in this deck. I think Centurion and Rika are two decks that I have very little praise for, and time again I may be proven wrong, but I don't know. I just feel that way. All right, so next up is Tier Elements. The Tier, my baby, my precious baby. I haven't played this deck in a while, but it's in a weird position for the next format. Now, why is that? Again, this one doesn't play that badly into destruction type effects. So removal is not the biggest deal against it. Usually you can steam through. As far as targeting goes, which there's a lot of, Mod Dragon is a pretty way to be through it. If you go first, your boards are very good. You can make a Dweller plus some other stuff, and that should hold them off. And you can play through hand traps decently well. However, you can play very little engine in this deck. It's similar to Branded in that regard. Very little engine. You're fully relying on your engine to break the field. And in Tier, that's a lot more monsters than spells. And that's the biggest difference between the Branded deck and the Tier deck. Maybe it has less bricks than Branded as well, but it still has those problems. And if your opponent knows you're playing Tier, which they will post side at the very least, it's very easy for them to pivot to ending on a board like Appaloosa plus Arvada, or just more effect negation type stock cards, which is a lot harder for you to beat. You're really going to need your non-engine to beat those. A lot of the time, I feel that is. At least that's how I feel. I think it's really hard for this deck to play through those negations. It can. Sometimes your hand is gas and you are able to push through stuff, but there aren't enough dead cards in Tier or enough dead combinations where you're going to have to take it slow a bit or rely on your first couple cards to get you going. And the negation really bogs you down. I think this deck has a decent choice because I think it's similar to Mannadium in its ability to play through hand traps very well and make a good field going first. But I think it's a bit better going second because it's better into removal effects versus negation effects. So it almost mirrors Mannadium in that way, with the biggest difference being how it plays into negation versus destruction. So I'd put it above it in that regard. I think it's very similar to Despia. I know some people may put it a little bit higher even. I'm not that hopeful on the deck, and I think it'll get a couple spots. I think these are the decks that'll get 1 and 2, maybe even 3 spots in Top Cut, but they will not be a huge presence. Next up is Flame Swordsman, fresh from Maze of Millennia. Where would I put this on a tier list? I played these cards for the first time at the Philadelphia Regional about a month ago, and they're cool. They're not bad. However, just getting the Drident plus maybe Book of Moon type effect, the pop in the book, really isn't that much. Yes, you can do a lot of this with one card, but it's not like it plays super well into Disruption, and it's not like it can really kill that easily either if your opponent just summons stuff in defense mode. Maybe you can play some combo variants using Promethean Princess, but it's just a fun rogue deck right now. It's what I want to see for these type of old Legacy reprints, where they give these decks these cool cohesive strategies that is playable, but they'll never top a YCS, or unless they get a lot of support, or maybe as an engine. But they're playable, but that's pretty much the extent of it. It's playable. Next up is Dragons. Dragons, you see the Mastodon be hit again and again. It keeps doing well. And in the TCG, it hasn't shared the exact level of success. I did see some play before, and this still has a lot of its cool combos intact. Unlike Mastodon, it didn't have Chaos Rule though, and that's a big reason why it wasn't as insane. In the TCG though, where does it stand? When it saw better success last fall, it was largely in part to Bystials being relatively good disruptions again. Versus the Unchained cards, being able to hit Yama was solid, and then hitting like Sorama or Solar Rage, also effective, and then good going first. And then it could also play a decent number of non-engine cards. So that puts it in a fine position. However, right now we're seeing Light and Dark is not present in the top 2 positions. And spoiler alert, that's not going to change. I think unless you're playing against a Voiceless Voice or Tier, which aren't going to be the most popular decks, your Bystials are pretty much just engine. They're not going to be disruption in any significant way. And when that happens, it feels like just a worse combo deck than something like Tier than Mannadium. And while it does have some merits and it's not an unplayable deck, I think it falls into the category of it's just a worse combo deck than something else. It has some 2-card combos like Raid Raptor, but I think the boards are probably just worse. And I think it's more weak to disruption. Nib, for example, I think is relatively easy to play through with Raid Raptor. The 1-card combos, if they nib properly, is a pain. But if you open up like any of the 2-card combos, it's fine. Or Dragon, it's still not the case. Other hand traps apply. Droll as well is huge right now, and Striker Dragon and Droll is so rough. Yeah, I think it's unlikely to make top cut, but I wouldn't be shocked if it did. It does have good end field and can play non-engines. Next up is Runic. So Runic did actually get support in Phantom Nightmare. It got Metamorphosis. And what that does is you tribute a fusion monster and a special something from your deck with the same level. I think it can also tribute synchros, but for the most part that's not relevant. So you can summon like Divine or the Herald, you can summon a Sprite monster. You can summon a Quem by tributing the Gary. You can tribute level 9 to summon generator monsters. You can tribute the level 5 to summon, I don't know what the hell you want to summon at level 5. You'll tell me. By tributing Freki, of course. The point is, Runic has even more options now as an engine than ever before. But the biggest thing with Runic is it feels like that deck can only thrive in formats where you don't need that much non-engine. Runic, as far as non-engine pieces go, do have a bit of utility in the sense they can be extenders with the fusion play, or you can use them for disruption, or to break through fields by negating effects, popping cards. But they're all just average at doing that, right? Runic Destruction and Freezing Curses aren't brilliant for breaking fields. There are many other board breakers I'd rather use before those. So if you're using those as your only board breakers, it's not going to cut it, right? No top deck is going to have a hard time dealing with a Forbidden Chalice equivalent effect. And now, in metas that are a lot slower and the engine is the king, having that utility is great on top of a powerful combo engine. That's what Runic accomplishes. That's what we saw before, where non-engine wasn't as important. Or in the case of the Bistro Runic deck, the Bistro is provided as non-engine a lot of the time as well. That's not going to be the case here, and Runic can struggle a bit. The max number of non-engine that Runic can fit in is lower than most other decks, and I think that in this format where its engine versus Fire King engine isn't going to keep up, it's not powerful enough, you need non-engine, and Runic will fall to the wayside, largely because of that. Now, again, like Labyrinth, not for the same reasons, but when the Fire King really stops being so oppressive and so powerful as a deck choice, then it may rise back up to the surface, right? It hasn't been significantly hit like it has been Master Duel or OCG, and it does have the new support card, more ways to play it now. Runic Generators, Runic Sprite, Runic for Hire, the best Runic deck still. Runic Goatee is one that's seeing play now. 2 new Goatee cards came out, and maybe even more that we haven't explored yet. It is possible. I just think now is not the time. I think it's unlikely to make top cut. Again, a couple good matchups, some going first hands. They could sneak in, but I wouldn't bet too heavily on it. Next up is Salamangreat. Why Salad? We are in the Year of Fire, and these are fire cards. We got new support from the Legendary Duels pack way months ago. Salamangreat Raging Phoenix is a very strong card in all the fire decks for Zelantis OTKs, but it's very good in this deck as well, because when you get to relink summon it using Sanctuary, it searches a card. And now this can mean searching a will, and then reviving 4 monsters, which sets up Dweller plays, which is pretty good. I can also search the counter trap, and while doing this also you are putting a Promethean Princess in the grave, which is very powerful disruption and extension, same as it is in every other fire deck. Now the biggest issue here is you don't have any good level 1 fires to summon, so you're not going to be using Diabellstar or the Sinful Spoil package, and that is a downside. Those cards are very powerful and you can't utilize them really effectively. Now that's not to say this deck is bad. You still have other really good cards like Mirage Dalio being legal. You have a new Stratos and Salamangreat of Fire, and you can play a lot of non-engine to compensate for maybe your deck's lack of ability to push going second. That being said, you also have access to cards like Splash Mage, and then Update Jammer's access code for easy lethal shots as well if you don't go with the Zelantis line. And there are a bit of confliction between those extra deck options, but they are good options nonetheless. I think Salad is actually underrated. Its ability to play an excessive number of non-engine and have relatively good one-card combos means it's a fine choice in the upcoming format. Now, I don't think it's anything brilliant. It feels like a worst cashier almost in some ways, but I wouldn't be surprised if it gets a top cut or 2. Actually, no, I'm going to put it up here. 1 or 2 top cut spots. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets one top cut, 2 top cuts. You can comfortably play like 18 hand traps in there, and then going first, it's good too. The one other thing that Salad has over its fire contemporaries is using Burning Draw. So Burning Draw, if you haven't heard of it, is technically a Salad card. It says in its text this counts as a Salamangreat card, but that doesn't mean it's only used in Salad. You can't technically use it in other decks. What it does is you can target a link monster in your opponent's field and then draw that many cards equal to its link ratings. Targeting an Appaloosa or an Ambler Whale means drawing 4 cards. Very powerful. Now, after you use it, you are locked into fires for the turn. In Salamangreat, that means no Splash Mage, Update Jammer, access code, Zelantis. However, you can still OTK using Raging Phoenix and something like Salamangreat Weasel with Princess to do combos that way. Not the end of the world. And then you also have Weasel. And then unlike the other fire decks, you don't have a reliance on Diabellstar. So if you played this in another deck, like in Fire King, and you drew into Wanteds or Diabell Stars, you wouldn't be able to use them. You also wouldn't be able to use Dark Charmer, Linkuriboh, all these other cards that, while not the most important parts of the deck, are a part of the deck you'd like to use and not cut yourself off of. Now, they are playable in these decks because sometimes the draw 4 or draw 3, depending on the board state, is powerful enough, especially if you're playing a board breaker type deck, but there are restrictions attached to it. In Salad, obviously, it is the most flexible, though. Being able to have almost no restrictions, drawing 3 to 4 cards can absolutely swing the tide of battle, especially if you hand trap them once or twice and they only able to end on an Ambler with a Princess Engrave and a Garunix Engrave. That happens pretty often, which is not a terrible field by any means. But if you draw 4 cards on top of that and then put a Bailing setup, you're actually in a good spot. So yeah, I would not be surprised if Salad is a fine choice for the next format. Next up, we got a brand new theme from Phantom Nightmare, the Goblin Bikers. So this deck, I have a hard time pinning down. A lot of its effects are really powerful. They replace themselves, they summon a solidly strong Exceed. You got new support for these type of Exceeds with the armor cards, but they don't feel powerful enough yet. Their output in terms of interruptions or ability to play through stuff is not really where I want it to be. If there's more Exceeds in the format and you can get like advantage out of those shenanigans with detaching off their monsters to summon, that's more for you. But I think it needs more support, more cards to really make it come together more, to be its own deck. Right now, I feel like you have to mix other engines with it to be cohesive, and I don't think that really works out that well, because the engines you want to fit in are like a Punk engine and that type of thing. I feel like any deck that has to rely on those as an engine is not going to be that good to begin with. It's like a red flag. But yeah, it can play non-engine, I guess, to a decent degree. It's not the worst thing in the world. And I think while people don't know what the cards do yet, it could steal a couple victories that it shouldn't. It's unlikely to make top cut, but I wouldn't be surprised if I did see 1 or 2 in there. Yeah, I'd say more unlikely than Kinsnag is spot, though. Like, I would not expect this continuously top. But it is on the precipice of being a better deck after the better fire decks get hit more, and we see more support cards potentially rolling in. What is a part of the lore for the Diabell Star, it is on the art, Diabell Star's there. Very likely we get more Goblin Bikers in the future. Moving on, we got a classic Sprite. Sprite and Tier, sticking with us for quite a while now. Sprite, though, has fallen off a lot in the recent times. Tier, while it has seen a resurgence in playability, Sprite is good against negation as well. Not against destruction. It's opposite to elements in that regard. And if Fire King is great at putting up destruction, Sprite kind of falters pretty drastically. Now, Sprite also has had a lot of its disruption weekend. Toad's been gone for quite a while. Elf's been gone for a while. It's got nothing new to replace that. I think Sprite's going to be slowly phased more and more until it's used as an engine in something else. As far as the pure Sprite deck goes, unless there's more support for rank 2s and that sort of thing, you may not see it make a comeback again, and I think it solidly falls in this will not make top cut category. Next up, we got Snake Eyes. So yes, Fire Kings will have Snake Eyes in them. Obviously, they are like mandatory at a competitive level, but pure Snake Eyes is playable too without Fire Kings. So why would you do that? Well, your end field is going to be worse. You don't have to play cards like Island, Sanctuary, Ponix, Garunix, Arvada that all don't do much on their own. At least you some brick your hands in some awkward combinations, and even Kieran, while doing nothing on its own, and sometimes being able to play through Emperor Veiler, is not a great draw and can contribute to brick hands. So being able to cut those for more non-engine or other type of extenders like Where Art Thou to play through Veiler Imperm can be solid, and there's merit to it. Now, it does mean you are weaker to board breakers. So if we see a transition to a heavier Snake Eye meta, we could see more board breakers being put in. I think right now hand traps are better because of the Fire King. The Fire Kings are a lot more resilient to board breakers. They present a lot more disruption from the hand and grave, via Kieran, a Garunix in the grave, and the Arvada coming out as well. Where Snake Eye can't do those things. It's more present on the field, only Princess really in the grave. But still, the field for the Snake Eye deck is pretty good. Now, you can play with Jet Synchron and a bunch of Synchros, or you can play without. I personally don't love the Synchros. I think you don't need them, and they take up a lot of extra deck space. However, I can see how it's sometimes warranted to have that extra negation because you lack it, and then you also don't have the disruption in the same way from the hand or grave that the Fire King deck does. So it's a little bit more oomph, but again, you're adding another brick card in your deck, as well as restricting your extra deck. Now, the pure version is no Jet Synchron to make Formula or Borlord Savage or Baron. It's just the same old Link monsters you'd use in the Fire King deck, but slimmer. The other upside you get is you can use Divine Temple to Snake Eye more easily. You can use it in Fire King, but it obviously has conflictions with Fire King Island, so you'd have to either not use it or use it afterwards. while blowing up your field, or figure it out in that way. But Divine Temple is nice to put guys spell and trap card zone to send off when you go first, but also when you go second, it helps playing in the field, because your opponent should be summoning a lot during your turn. They should be summoning with the Flame Burge, either bringing back from the spell and trap card zone, or bringing back from the grave, or using Princess, or Garunix, Kieran. Either way, there's a high chance they're going to be summoning during your turn. That turns Temple into an extender of sorts, which is nice, especially when you open up that Bellstar plus Populace. You search into 2 Sinful Spoil cards. If you search the original Sinful Spoil Snake Eye, the other one is useless, right? And when you play Divine Temple, that's not the case. And in fact, Divine Temple going second is probably better than Sinful Spoil, especially if you're not summoning Ponix from the deck. Where does it put Snake Eye in regards to that? Personally, I'm at the position that it is worse than Fire King, but I don't think it's worse by much. I think Fire King just has more power behind it, which you may argue is not needed, but I think that power makes it less vulnerable to board breakers, which, despite not being the most popular option, is still an option that is present and seeing some play. So Soul Release, Thrust, Talents, and this deck does a way better job of playing around than the Snake Eye deck does. And then the Fire King cards, while individually may not be that great, when you are drawing them in combinations with each other, and then there are some hands where they do help you quite a bit. It's not like they're just entirely dead all the time. They aren't the same thing as drawing a gem like Garden back in the old days. So they're not full on bricks. And then Kieran can be good to play through stuff as well, right? You get Impermed on Snake Eye Ash. Chain Kieran is pretty nice. So yeah, I think this deck is very good, and it's clear that the Snake Eye engine is king of this format. It's not the Fire King cards, it's Snake Eye cards. However, I think the synergy with the Fire King cards does push them to a better spot than Pure. It's these 2 decks that will absolutely dominate YCS Top Cuts. And I expect to see probably 75% of the YCS Top Cuts shared between these 2 decks. Next up is Vanquish Soul. Another one of these decks that I always put too low. And that will not change today. I think the disruption in this deck is not good at all. You can maybe put a Book of Moon type effects, maybe a board nuke effect, maybe draw a couple cards. But when I've played this deck more in Master Duel, I realized you actually just can't fit in that much non-engine. So it's not even a good mid-range deck in that way. What's nice though is, I guess, his hand traps suck against it. When everyone's playing a bunch of hand traps like now, then Vanquish Soul thrives in that regard. I just wish it did more with its field. And now you could maybe try to do stuff with turn 1 Dweller and go Rosin, add continue back, Rosin, make Dweller, and then pass, and then Rock gets back on their turn. But there's no way that's enough disruption. And the deck's not even that consistent. I really don't like this deck. I think this deck will not make top cut. I would be surprised, but I've been proven wrong, so we'll see. Next up is Rescue Ace. This is the last fire deck. Where do I put it? Where do I put Rescue Ace? I think this deck is a lot worse than the other fire decks. Now, why is that? For one, you don't get to use the Snake Eye cards, and remember, I said those are the king. You don't get to use cards like Flame Burge. You don't get to use Snake Eye Ash. Maybe you can mix those in. I think it's too clunky of a deck to mix it all together. I don't like that you have all these traps in your deck that you draw and they do nothing. Even like Alert or Rescue aren't great. I think your end board is also worse than the other decks, and you do have the weakness to stuff like Lightning Storm and Dust to your post side, which I don't like. And I think there's just I don't see an advantage to play this deck over the other fire decks. It's not bad. It's not bad. And the end fields are still good. They still outclass a lot of things. And with Princess, it gets more extension. And it gets easy access to Sunlight Wolf and then Heat Soul. And it's fine. But I just think it's worse in every single way than these decks. And I'm still yet to find a good reason to play Rescue Ace over this. I feel like it's brickier, plays through stuff worse, and can play less non-engine. So it just sits down here. Now, it's a few will tops, though, because people like this deck more often. I think it is an easier deck to play. And it's good. I think it's an easier deck to play. And people will still play it, and the deck is still fine. You go first, or you draw well, versus Fire King decks, or the Snake Eye deck. It's not like you're that much worse than it. And you can still easily do well. And I think it will still see several spots in Top Cut, but I think it will be a clear distinction between these decks and then these two in terms of representation once you reach that final cut stage of the tournament. Next up is Mikanko. So Mikanko saw a lot of play last format. You can do some Gen and Ken stuff and then make Acid Golem. That's pretty good. However, I sold this band, and I think that is a huge hit to the deck. Now, I could be wrong. This is a deck that I had a basic understanding of, and there were ways to play this that didn't require Isold, and you can still cheese wins out with some gimmick stuff where you attack into their monster and burn them. And your ability to play through fields is still there, and you have the armor cards now to pull some shenanigans off with. That's not like a terrible unplayable deck, but I think it's still, like, in terms of power level, not much better than like a Flame Swordsman type deck, especially without Isold, But yeah, I think this deck will just not make top cut. Isolt Hit is pretty overwhelming. Next up, the last new theme from Phantom Nightmare, and that is Voiceless Voice. So this deck is probably the second or third, maybe fourth most represented deck in the OCG. It has been a meta-relevant threat since its release, and it's honestly a lot worse than I expected it to be. When I started playing this deck, I started realizing that the most you're really ending on is a couple interrupts. You can put up the Sarvis, and you can put up the Skull Guardian, and you can get the trap up, which will pop a card, but that's really it. The rest you're relying on non-engine. And as far as the amount of non-engine you can play, because it's a ritual deck and often does require multi-card combinations or these heavy Garnet counts, you're really just playing less non-engine than these top two decks, which is crazy. Okay, what's the advantage then? Is it really good against Disruption? No. If I get impermed on low or on Diviner, there are many times I've looked at my hand and been like, okay, I pass. Or Droll can hurt. Sometimes it doesn't matter, right? It's like Fire King in some hands, or Snake Eye, where there are many hands you can play through Disruption, but there are a fair number of hands where you lose to a single Imperm Rash. And it's the same thing, and I don't think it's any worse than Fire King or Snake Eye than playing through a single Imperm Rash. It can be hit or miss more than I'd like, but if I'm playing a deck that's weaker, I want it to make up for that, and it's not. So that's my biggest problem with it. I think it's not powerful, and then it's also just not even the most consistent thing in the world, and it doesn't play as much non-engine, and I'm just confused where the allure is for the deck. Now, I understand in the OCG there's an allure in the sense that when you get Maxied, this deck puts up a lot for relatively little in terms of giving them Maxi. That's not the case here, though, and I think that is a huge thing, right? Because if Maxi's happening 30% or so of the games, and this deck plays through pretty effectively, then this has more merit. And I think that is enough to knock it down. Now, is this deck unplayable? No. If it goes first, and it can play through hand traps, and it can make a decent field. You back up the field with a hand trap or two. The quality of its negation is extremely high. Sarvis is a great negate. Skull Guardian is very broad in terms of what it does. And you do have pop as well. You have two negates and a pop. It's diversified. And yeah, it's not bad at all. So it's not like your field's terrible. It almost reminds me Salad-esque from a couple of years ago. But ultimately, I think it has weaknesses. And I think it probably fits in like this position where one or two will top. Maybe you can push it up here, but when I played, I haven't had too much faith. Now, as I learn the deck more, I may grow a better appreciation for it. Maybe I'll think it deserves to be in a higher spot. But as for now, I just don't see the huge draw to this deck. I don't think it's brilliant. And I'm saying that like it's so negative because the expectation you have when you look at the OCG metagames is that it should be the next best thing to compete in against Fire. And I just don't think it is. It's still a fine deck. And when these get hit, there's a good chance this will be a pretty relevant threat. I just think comparing these two, there's a clear winner. Next up is Unchained. Yeah, so I talked about before how this deck can have some life in it past the ban list. And now the new Fire deck, it just gets harder and harder as everything else grows in power. It almost feels like we're being left in the dust as an Unchained player. Now, as far as Disruption goes, playing into Destruction effects is not the end of the world, not that hard for you. Or if they hold the Destruction for the right times, like destroying a Yama is pretty rough. Like you are losing the net 2 link bodies there. And you can't make that up that easily. It is kind of just gone. And then there's still Arvada, there's still Apollo, there's everything else coming afterwards. Yeah, I just don't see it. The consistency hits are pretty bad too. It makes it so that you have to play other engines to supplement it, engines that aren't as good in the hand traps, or you're playing more bricks. It doesn't have what it takes. You can't play that much non-engine either, which is a huge problem. Now, pre-ban list, I would have said maybe it has a chance because it can play into the Destruction effects okay, and it's consistent, and it doesn't lose to hand traps easily, and for a hand trap format, it thrives in that regard. The consistency hits really make it a lot worse in terms of actual ability to play, and then also how easily it plays through hand traps. So I think ultimately this deck can't make top cut, which is very sad for me to say. And maybe I'm being overly dismissive after testing it a couple times for Snake Eye and just having a hard time, but it's not it. Lastly is Hero, fan favorite. This should be obvious. I question if I should even bring it onto these tier lists, but it attracts all the haters, so I like to shit talk Hero to increase the engagement and negativity in the comments. And Heroes, yes, you can do some cool stuff with Dark Claw. Yes, you have the cool combos with Dark Angel. A lot of hand traps in the meta, though. There's a lot of Nibiru's. You struggle versus that. A lot of Drolls. You struggle versus that. How are you going to go second? I don't know. Renfield's not even the best thing in the world. It's probably just not good. And yeah, it shouldn't be anything crazy here. It's been a rogue deck, and when every other deck is getting better and it's not, then it shouldn't be a surprise. The only time that would change if it has good matchups into what is now the best deck. And it doesn't play into Destruction particularly well, so I don't think that has changed at all. I guess Dark Claw's a nice thing to have against these fire decks, but Dark Claw's always good. If that's not enough to make heroes playable, then what's changed, right? Okay, so that's everything, guys. That is all of these decks. And if there were any decks that I missed, please let me know so I can add them for future tier lists. I try and get everything I feel like is worth mentioning together, but sometimes there's stuff I miss. But then also, if I made any rankings you don't agree with, let me know. Criticism is appreciated, right? And when you do, mention why, right? Obviously, you want to be able to elaborate upon your thoughts. It helps you grow as a player because you have to be able to explain yourself. But then also, it lets me actually understand your thought process, so maybe I can learn something from it and incorporate that in the future. And then make sure to come back soon. I know this has been a long video. The next one will probably be even longer. And I feel like it's worth it because I get to go in depth to explain my thought processes. So just let me know if you agree and if you want to see more of these. I do these because they get good engagement, but if you guys don't want to see tier lists like this to this, in-depth level, then I'll do what you guys wish. But yeah, see you guys all next time. Peace. Thank you guys for watching the video. A great way to support the channel is to get the TSX1 sleeves on tsx1.com. These are the sleeves I use at every event. They are fantastic quality. They feel really great to shuffle in your hand, your deck, fanning out your grave. They slide really smoothly, and they last the entire tournament, so you're not compromising quality either. Use the code POTATO10 on the website. You'll get 10% off across everything.